Dorian Castellan stood in front of the floor-length mirror in his penthouse bedroom. He adjusted the collar of his dress shirt with the kind of patience he never extended to people. He only saved it for appearances. Tonight was the annual Syndicate Elite Gala. Now, for those who don't know what the Syndicate Elite Gala is, think of it as the Oscars. Except nobody on the guest list has ever paid a tax in their life. And the champagne is the least dangerous thing in the room. Dorian knew that. He also knew exactly who he was walking in with tonight, and it wasn't his wife. Vivienne Lacqua was already in the living room. Her perfume drifted under the bedroom door like an announcement. He straightened his collar one final time. He looked at the man in the mirror and smiled the kind of smile that has nothing warm behind it. The bedroom door opened quietly behind him. It was Serafina. She walked in the way she always did. Careful, measured, like a woman who had spent years making herself smaller so that a bigger man could feel tall. She crossed the room slowly and stopped just behind him. She was close enough that he could see her reflection in the same mirror he had been admiring himself in. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders in loose waves. Her eyes were steady, but her hands were not. She placed one hand gently against his arm. "Dorian," she said softly. He didn't turn. "I need you to look at me," she said. "I'm looking at you," he replied, still watching himself. She exhaled slowly. "It's been over a year," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, but it carried the full weight of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for months. "A year of you coming home late, leaving early, and sleeping in this bed like I'm not in it." Dorian finally turned. He looked at her, really looked at her. And what crossed his face wasn't guilt. It was impatience. "Serafina," he said. He used the tone of a man wrapping up a meeting that should never have been scheduled. "I want a divorce." The words landed the way a door closing does. Not loud, but final. Serafina didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She stood exactly where she was. And something behind her eyes shifted. Something quiet. Something that had been waiting a very long time to move. "You were never built for rooms like this," Dorian continued, turning back to the mirror. "You're too still, too plain, too soft for the world I operate in. I've been carrying the weight of this marriage out of courtesy, not love. Vivienne understands my world. You never did." He reached for his jacket from the chair beside the wardrobe, shrugged it on, and walked toward the door without looking back. "Pack your things before I return," he said. The front door closed behind him. The penthouse went silent. Serafina stood in the middle of that room for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked to the dresser and opened the bottom drawer. It was the one she hadn't opened in 7 years. She reached inside. Her fingers found what they were looking for. She straightened up and looked at herself in that same mirror Dorian had just been admiring himself in. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't look away. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. And that call is the moment Dorian Castellan's world began to come apart. He just didn't know it yet. The Castellan group's private car pulled up to the entrance of the Meridian Hall at exactly 8:15. Dorian stepped out like a man who had personally arranged for the night to be beautiful. He buttoned his jacket, turned, and offered his hand to Vivienne. She took it. Now, Vivienne was the kind of woman who made entrance halls feel smaller just by walking into them. Tall, sharp-featured, dressed in a deep emerald gown. It probably cost more than most people's rent for 6 months. She smiled at the cameras. Dorian smiled at nothing in particular, which was somehow more intimidating. The doors of the Meridian Hall opened for them. The warmth of the ballroom spilled out. Crystal chandeliers, the low hum of a string quartet, the soft percussion of 100 conversations. Everyone was in some way watching each other. Dorian walked in like he owned the floor beneath him. Several men turned. A few nodded. One raised a glass in his direction. And then, as it always happens in rooms full of people who notice everything, someone noticed something that wasn't there. "Where is Serafina?" It was Claudette Reyes who said it first, half to herself and half to the woman standing beside her. Her champagne glass paused just before it reached her lips. Claudette had been attending this gala for 11 years running, and in that time, Serafina Voss had never once been absent, not when she had a fever, not when she and Dorian had reportedly not spoken for 2 weeks straight, which, now that Claudette thought about it, seemed to happen more and more often in recent years. He came with someone else, the woman beside her murmured, nodding in Dorian's direction. Claudette looked. She watched Vivian laugh at something Dorian said. Her hand was resting on his arm with the ease of a woman who had been rehearsing that posture for a while. Well, Claudette said quietly, setting her glass down. That's either very bold or very stupid. She hadn't yet decided which. Across the ballroom, Dorian was shaking hands with Emilio Vance. Emilio was one of the 3 men in the room whose approval actually meant something in the circles Dorian moved in. Good to see you, Castellan, Emilio said. His eyes briefly cut to Vivian before returning to Dorian's face. You as well, Dorian replied smoothly. A pause that lasted just half a second too long settled between them. Serafina not joining you tonight? Emilio asked. His voice was light and conversational, the way people ask questions when the answer already concerns them. She sends her regrets, Dorian said. Emilio nodded slowly, the way men do when they've decided to store a piece of information rather than respond to it. Pity, he said simply, and then he moved on. Dorian watched him go, adjusted his cuffs, and turned back to Vivienne. She was already steering them toward the bar and saying something about the music. He smiled and followed her. Back at the penthouse, the city outside the windows was doing what cities do at night, glittering on, unbothered. Serafina hadn't moved from the center of the bedroom for a while after the door closed. She had just stood there in the quiet. She let the silence settle around her, the way you let a room air out after something has been burning in it. She had been in this marriage for 7 years. 7 years of being the woman who softened herself, so that a loud man could feel like the most important person in every room they entered together. 7 years of sitting at tables where people spoke past her, assuming she had nothing to say. She wasn't angry. She was, if anything, remarkably calm. And that calmness, that particular settled kind, was the most dangerous thing in the penthouse right now, though nobody was there to notice it. She walked to the dresser and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a folded silk cloth, was a sealed envelope, a small key, and a name she hadn't used in 7 years. She picked up the envelope and turned it over in her hands. The Morty family seal was pressed into the wax on the back. Her family's seal, her father's mark. The stamp of an empire that most people in this city spoke about only in careful tones and lower voices. She had buried this 7 years ago, the week after her wedding, because a man she loved had been building something fragile, and she hadn't wanted the weight of her name to crush it before it could stand. She had given him the one gift no one in her world gives freely: anonymity. She had protected him. She set the envelope down on the dresser, picked up the small key, and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at herself in the mirror again. You were never built for rooms like this, she repeated quietly. She almost laughed. She was, in fact, built for rooms that most people never get to enter at all. She picked up her phone. It rang twice before the line connected. The voice on the other end was deep and unhurried. It carried the kind of quiet that belongs to men who have never once needed to raise their voice to be obeyed. Serafina, he said. Nikolai, she replied. A brief silence. It's time, she said. Another pause, shorter this time. I'll be there in 40 minutes, Nikolai said. The call ended. Serafina set the phone down. She pulled open the wardrobe on the far side of the room. She reached past 7 years' worth of clothes that had all been chosen to make her forgettable. Right at the back, sealed in a black garment bag she had never once unzipped, was a gown. She had been keeping it for a night exactly like this one. She pulled the zip down slowly, and for the first time in a very long time, Serafina Mortivas smiled. 40 minutes. That was how long she had before Nikolai arrived. And Serafina intended to use every one of them. She carried the sealed envelope to the sitting area, lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, and broke the wax seal with her thumb. The way you open something you know will change the temperature of the room. Inside were 3 documents folded in thirds, crisp despite the years. The first was a transfer of authority signed by her father, Aldo Morty, 2 weeks before he died. It named Serafina as sole heir to the Morty family's holdings. This included, among other things, a 40% stake in what was now called the Castellan Empire. She set it on the cushion beside her. The second was a legal suppression order, with her own signature at the bottom. It was dated 7 years ago, the week after her wedding to Dorian. She had filed it herself. She had paid a lawyer she trusted with her life to make sure her name, her lineage, and every public record connecting her to the Morty family was buried. Buried so deeply that even a determined man would need years to find it. She stared at her own signature for a moment. The handwriting was younger, slightly less steady. She had been 26 years old when she signed it. She remembered sitting in a lawyer's office with a cup of tea she never touched, telling herself she was doing the right thing. She remembered the lawyer, a quiet, careful man named Ferris. He looked at her over the top of his glasses and asked, "Miss Morty, you understand what you are giving up?" "I understand," she had told him. "And you are certain?" he had asked. She had looked out the window for a moment before answering. "He's building something," she had said. "If my name is attached to him before he's ready, every enemy my father ever made becomes his enemy overnight. He isn't strong enough for that yet." Ferris had held her gaze for a long second. "And when he is strong enough?" he had asked. She had smiled quietly then. "Then we revisit the conversation," she had said. She had never imagined sitting in that office, at 26, that the conversation she would eventually revisit would look nothing like the one she had planned. She set the second document down and picked up the third. This one was different from the others. No legal language, no official stamps. It was a letter, handwritten in her father's particular slant. She had read it so many times in her head, over the years, that she had almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But here it was. "Serafina," it began. "I've never once asked you to be smaller than you are. Whatever you're choosing to do for this man, make sure he's worth the cost. Because the Morty name doesn't go quietly, and when it returns, it doesn't apologize. Don't forget whose daughter you are. Papa." She folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands for a moment. Her father had died 14 months after she signed those suppression papers. She had grieved him in the way people grieve when they can't afford to fall apart. Quietly, at odd hours, in rooms where nobody was watching, Dorian had attended the funeral. He had held her hand. He had said all the right things to all the right people. And she had told herself, standing at the graveside, that she had made the right choice, that protecting him had been worth it. That love was sometimes the decision to carry something heavy so that another person didn't have to. She understood now, sitting in the half-dark of the penthouse he had just told her to vacate, that she had confused love with sacrifice so many times that she had stopped being able to tell them apart. There's a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from realizing that you handed something precious to a person who never once asked what it cost you. That was the grief sitting with her now. She didn't cry. She gathered the 3 documents, aligned the edges, and slid them back into the envelope. Then she stood, walked back to the dresser, and placed the envelope in the inside pocket of the garment bag that held the black gown. She wasn't leaving it behind tonight. Her phone lit up on the dresser. A message from Nikolai. 30 minutes out. "Do you need anything?" She looked at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Just yourself." 3 dots appeared. "Then that is all I have ever brought." She almost smiled at that. She set the phone down and walked to the bathroom to begin getting ready. As she stood at the basin, she looked at her reflection with the kind of attention she hadn't given herself in years. Not checking, not criticizing, just looking. Her father used to say that the most powerful thing a Morty could walk into a room with was the complete absence of doubt. Not arrogance. He had told her once when she was perhaps 16 and preparing for her first formal dinner with the families. Arrogance is loud, and it makes mistakes. I'm talking about something quieter than that. The kind of certainty that doesn't need to announce itself because the room already feels it the moment you walk in. She had been 16 then and had nodded because she trusted him. She was 33 now and understood exactly what he meant. She reached for her mother's diamond earrings, the ones she had kept in a small pouch at the back of the drawer for 7 years. She never wore them because this life hadn't felt like the right occasion for them. Tonight felt like the right occasion. She pressed the first one into place, then the second. In the living room, the city lights continued to glow quietly through the tall windows. And somewhere across that city, in a ballroom full of men who thought they knew everything, Her husband was laughing at something Vivienne said. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. The knock at the penthouse door came at exactly the time Nikolai said it would. Not a second early, not a second late. That was the thing about Nikolai Draoff. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep, and he didn't keep people waiting. Serafina crossed the living room and opened the door herself. He was standing in the hallway in all black. No tie, no pocket square. None of the decorative effort that the men at tonight's gala would be drowning in. He didn't need any of it. Nikolai was the kind of man who made a doorway feel smaller just by standing in it. Broad across the shoulders, unhurried in the way, only people who have never needed to rush tend to be. With ink crawling up the left side of his neck in patterns that told a story most people wouldn't dare ask about. He looked at her for a moment. "You look like your father," he said. It wasn't a compliment or a comfort. It was simply the truth, offered the way Nikolai offered most things, plainly without packaging. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside. He glanced once around the penthouse with the quiet, instinctive assessment of a man who had spent decades walking into unfamiliar rooms and calculating them before his coat was off. "He's already at the gala," Serafina said, answering the question he hadn't asked. "I know," Nikolai replied. He arrived at 8:15 with the Lacqua woman. Serafina looked at him. "You were already watching," she said. "I'm always watching," he said simply. "That's what your father paid me to do." He settled into the armchair across from the couch with the ease of a man who had sat in more dangerous rooms than this one and found them all manageable. Serafina sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had known each other long enough to not need noise to fill the space. "How long have you known?" she asked, though some part of her already knew the answer. "About Dorian's intentions?" "About all of it," she said. "How long have you known that he had been pulling away?" Nikolai looked at her steadily. "Long enough," he said. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because you asked me not to," he said. 7 years ago when you filed those papers. You sat in Ferris's office, and then you called me from the car on the way home. And you said, and I remember this precisely, you said, "Nikolai, whatever you see, whatever happens, let me handle my own marriage." Serafina was quiet. "You said you didn't want your father's world reaching into your home," he continued, "so I stayed out of your home. I watched from a distance the way you asked me to." He paused. "But I watched," he added. "Every year at the gala, every business deal Dorian made using access he only had because of who you are. Every room he walked into with your family's weight behind him, and not a single person knowing it." There was no accusation in his voice. He wasn't angry on her behalf, or at least he wasn't showing it. But there was something underneath the calm. Something that had clearly been sitting there for a while, waiting for this exact conversation. "He told me to pack my things," Serafina said. Nikolai nodded once. "I heard." She looked at him. "How?" "The car," he said. "I had someone on the building from the moment I got your first message last week." "Last week," she said. "You reached out last week. You sent me a single word." He said, "You sent me Nikolai with no punctuation and no follow-up." He allowed the smallest pause. "In 7 years, you had never once initiated contact. I knew what it meant." Serafina looked at her hands for a moment. She had sent that message on a Tuesday evening. She was sitting in the back of a car after attending a dinner she hadn't been introduced at. After watching Dorian shake hands with 12 men and not once gesture in her direction to say, "This is my wife." She had typed his name and then stared at it for a long time before pressing send. She hadn't known then what she was ready for. She knew now. "The documents are in order," she said. "The Morty stake in his empire is fully documented and legally intact." "I know," Nikolai said. "Ferris sent me confirmation this afternoon." "Of course he did," she said almost to herself. Nikolai leaned forward slightly. His forearms rested on his knees. His eyes held hers with the kind of directness that most people found difficult to sustain. "I have one question for you," he said, "and I need you to answer it honestly." "When have I ever answered you any other way?" she said. The corner of his mouth shifted barely, but it was there. "Are you done asking me not to?" he said. The question sat between them, plain and unhurried. It wasn't about tonight specifically, or the gala, or the documents she was carrying in the pocket of a sealed garment bag in the next room. It was about all of it. All 7 years of her asking him in various ways to stand back, to stay out, to let her be a wife before she was a Morty. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. Nikolai nodded once and sat back. Then let's go get your name back, he said. Nikolai's words settled in the room like a decision that had already been made. Serafina stood, smoothed the front of her robe, and looked toward the bedroom door. Give me 20 minutes, she said. Take 30, Nikolai replied. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone with the calm of a man who had plenty to attend to while he waited. She almost said something else, then decided against it and walked back into the bedroom. The garment bag was exactly where she had left it. It was hanging on the wardrobe door, unzipped from the bottom where she had opened it earlier, and then stopped. As if she had needed to confirm it was still there before she could fully commit to the evening ahead. It was still there. She pulled the zip the rest of the way up and drew the gown out carefully. Black, structured at the top with a corset bodice that had been made for her, specifically cut to fit a version of herself she had folded away and placed in storage. Along with the garment bag and the documents and her mother's earrings. The skirt fell long and full with a high slit on the left side that gave the whole thing an edge. Not aggressive, but deliberate. The kind of gown that doesn't ask for the room's attention, the kind that simply takes it. She laid it across the bed and stood looking at it for a moment. There's a particular thing that happens to a person who spends years making themselves smaller than they are. They begin to forget the dimensions of their actual size. Not physically, but in every other sense. They forget the space they used to occupy, the way a room used to turn when they entered it, the weight their name used to carry before they chose to set it down. Looking at that gown, Serafina remembered. She dressed carefully, not in a hurry, because tonight wasn't an event she was rushing toward. Tonight was a conclusion she was walking into with both eyes open. When the corset was fastened, and the skirt fell the way it was supposed to, she stood in front of the mirror. She checked not her appearance, but her expression. Steady. Good. She reached up and touched the diamond at her left ear, already in place as it had been since she put them on an hour ago. Her mother had worn these earrings to every event that mattered. Her mother, who had been a Morty in every room she ever walked into, and had never once apologized for the space she occupied. Serafina had inherited more from her than the diamonds. She just needed tonight to remind her of that. She picked up a small card from the top of the dresser. It was one she had written earlier while Nikolai was on his way. On it, in her own handwriting, were 3 words. Serafina Morty Voss. Her name. Her full name. The one she hadn't said out loud, not once in 7 years. She looked at it, then she said it quietly to no one but herself in the mirror. Serafina Morty Voss. It felt strange in her mouth. The way a word feels when you haven't used it in so long that you have to relearn the shape of it. And then it felt like something else entirely. It felt accurate. She set the card down, picked up the envelope from the garment bag's pocket, and tucked it into the small evening clutch on the dresser. Then she took one last look at herself. Not to check, not to adjust, just to see. She walked out of the bedroom. Nikolai was still in the armchair, phone in hand. But he looked up the moment she appeared in the doorway. Not because she made a sound, but because that is the thing about a person who has finally stopped making themselves small. The room notices before you even open your mouth. He stood. He didn't say anything. He didn't reach for a compliment or a reassurance, or any of the things that a lesser man in this moment might have felt the need to produce. He simply looked at her with the full attention of someone who had known exactly who she was long before tonight had confirmed it for the rest of the world. A few seconds passed. Your father would have stood up too, he said finally. It was the only thing he said. It was without question the only thing that needed to be said. Serafina held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. A short, composed nod that carried more inside it than most people fit into full conversations. The car, she asked. Ready, he said. How long to the Meridian, she asked. 12 minutes, he said. Dorian has been there for just over an hour. She picked up her clutch. Good, she said. He's had enough time to get comfortable. Nikolai reached past her and held the front door open. She walked through it without hesitating. Without looking back at the penthouse, that had for 7 years belonged to a version of herself she no longer had any use for. The corridor lights were bright after the dim warmth of the apartment. Her heels connected with the floor in a clean, even rhythm. As she walked toward the elevator, Nikolai fell into step beside her, not behind her, not ahead of her, beside her, which, if anyone who knew anything about Nikolai Drov had been there to witness it, would have told them everything they needed to know about what kind of night this was going to be. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. And somewhere across the city, in a ballroom full of people who thought they already knew how the evening would end, Dorian Castellan was laughing at something Vivienne said. He wouldn't be laughing for very much longer. The car stopped outside the Meridian Hall at 9:47. Nikolai stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand. Serafina took it, stepped out onto the pavement, and straightened. The night air was cool against her shoulders. Above the entrance, the Meridian's facade was lit in warm gold, the kind of lighting that was designed to make everyone look important. Serafina had never needed the lighting. A valet near the door glanced at her, then at Nikolai, and then did something valets at events like this are professionally trained not to do. He stared. Nikolai noticed. He always noticed everything. "Shall we?" he said quietly without looking at her. "We shall," she said. They walked toward the entrance together, unhurried. The kind of unhurried that isn't slowness, but rather the complete absence of urgency. The walk of two people who understand that the room will still be there when they arrive, and that their arrival will be worth the wait. The doors opened. Inside the Meridian Ballroom, the evening had reached that particular hour when events like this find their rhythm. Glasses refilled, jackets unbuttoned by a single button, voices a half note louder than they had been at the start of the night. Dorian was at the far end of the room near the bar. He was standing in a loose circle with Emilio Vance and two other men whose names appeared regularly in financial reports that were never meant to be made public. Vivienne was beside him. She was contributing to the conversation in the way a person contributes when they understand the aesthetic requirement of their presence, but not the content of what's being discussed. She was good at that. The Brower contracts, one of the men was saying, are going to need a guarantor that the Eastern families will actually respect. Dorian nodded, about to respond. And then something shifted. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement he could point to. It was the kind of change that moves through a crowded room the way a drop of ink moves through water, starting at one edge and spreading outward until the whole thing is different, and you can't quite identify the moment it changed. Conversations didn't stop all at once. They tapered. One thread dropped, then another, until the hum of the room had dropped a full register in the space of about 15 seconds. Dorian frowned slightly and looked toward the entrance. Half the room was already looking. Claudette Ray, standing not far from the entrance with a fresh glass of champagne she hadn't yet sipped, was the first person in Serafina's eye line. She watched Claudette's expression move through 3 distinct stages in quick succession. Recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked very much like satisfaction. "Good Lord," Claudette said to nobody in particular. Serafina didn't look at her. She looked straight ahead. Her chin was level, her pace exactly what it had been when she stepped through the door. Beside her, Nikolai moved the same way he always moved. Like weather. Like something you step aside for, not because you've been asked to, but because every instinct you have tells you it's the right thing to do. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The way people move when they become aware without being told that they are standing in the path of something significant. Champagne glasses lowered. A woman mid-sentence stopped speaking and didn't resume. A man near the center of the room leaned toward the person beside him and said something low that made the second person turn sharply toward the entrance. Then that person turned to someone else. Emilio Vance saw her before Dorian did. Emilio, who had been in this world for 30 years and had learned to read a room the way other men read financial statements, went very still. He set his glass down on the nearest surface with a care that suggested he wanted both hands free. "Castellan," he said quietly. Dorian was still scanning the room, trying to locate the source of the shift. Castellan, Emilio said again. He used a tone that made Dorian turn to look at him instead. Emilio wasn't looking at Dorian. He was looking at the entrance. Dorian followed his line of sight. He saw the gown first. Black, structured, unmistakable. Then he saw the face. His brain performed the particular slow-motion calculation that happens when the mind sees something it recognizes, but refuses for a full second to accept. Serafina, his wife. The woman he had told 3 hours ago to pack her things before he returned. She was here. She was wearing a gown he had never seen before. She was wearing her mother's diamonds. And she was walking through his ballroom like she had done it 1,000 times. Not looking for him, not performing for the room. Simply moving through it with the kind of ownership that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. Then his eyes moved to the man beside her. The recognition landed differently this time. It didn't come slowly. It arrived all at once like a door blown open. Nikolai Drov. The name moved through Dorian's chest before it reached his mind. Every man in this room knew that name. Every alliance, every deal, every territory arrangement in the syndicate existed within a structure that Nikolai Drov had, at various points, either built, approved, or allowed to continue by choosing not to end it. Nobody brought Nikolai Drov to a social event. Nikolai Drov came to events when he had a reason. The color left Dorian's face in a way that Vivienne noticed immediately. "Dorian," she said. He didn't answer her. He couldn't in that moment have told her what to say, even if he wanted to. Because Serafina had just looked across the ballroom and found him in the crowd. Not searching, not hoping. She simply looked, the way a person looks when they already know exactly where something is. And then she held his gaze for precisely 3 seconds. And then she looked away. That, more than anything else that had happened in the last 3 hours, was the moment Dorian Castellan understood that something had gone very, very wrong. Serafina didn't go to Dorian. That was the first thing he noticed, and the thing that unsettled him most. She didn't cross the room toward him, didn't seek confrontation, didn't even orient herself in his direction after that single 3-second look. She simply moved through the ballroom the way someone moves through a space that belongs to them, stopping where she chose to stop, greeting whom she chose to greet. Entirely indifferent to the fact that her husband was standing 40 feet away, watching every second of it, Dorian stayed where he was. Vivienne had stopped talking. Even she could read the room well enough to understand that whatever was happening was significantly above the level of a surprise appearance. "Who is she?" Vivienne asked quietly, leaning slightly toward Dorian. "My wife," Dorian said. Vivienne looked at him. "Your wife?" she repeated. "The one you told me was." "Yes," he said, cutting her off. He didn't need the sentence finished. Emilio Vance was already moving across the room, not toward Dorian, toward Serafina. Dorian watched Emilio approach her. Emilio, who had spent the better part of this evening discussing Eastern Territory guarantors and the difficulty of finding anyone the old families actually respected. And he watched Emilio do something he had never once done in 30 years of operating in this world. He bowed his head, not deeply, not in a theatrical way, just a slight forward incline. The kind of gesture that means something only to people who understand what it costs a man like Emilio to make it. "Serafina," Emilio said. There was a warmth in his voice that Dorian had genuinely never heard directed at himself in all the years they had been doing business. "Emilio," she replied. "It's been far too long," he said. "It has," she agreed. "Your father would be pleased to see you standing in this room," Emilio said. "I hope so," she said. "Though I suspect he would also tell me I took too long to get here." Emilio smiled at that, a real smile, not the carefully managed expression he wore for negotiations. "He would," Emilio said. "He definitely would." He glanced briefly in Dorian's direction, a glance so short it barely registered as deliberate, and then returned his full attention to Serafina. "We have much to discuss," he said. "We do," she agreed. "But not tonight," she added. "Tonight I am simply here." Emilio nodded as though that were a perfectly complete and satisfying answer, which told Dorian everything he needed to know about the level of authority she was operating at. Because Emilio Vance didn't accept incomplete answers from anyone. Dorian's jaw tightened. He was doing the calculation now. The way a man does when a fact he has been ignoring forces itself into the light. running back through years of meetings and agreements and handshakes, reordering them against new information. The brower contracts. 3 years ago, the Brower family had come to the table reluctant and left cooperative. Dorian had assumed it was his negotiation. He was reconsidering that assumption now. The Meridian access. The Meridian Hall didn't extend event hosting to just anyone. There was a vetting process. A quiet one, run through back channels that Dorian had never fully mapped. He had always assumed his standing in the syndicate had opened that door. He was reconsidering that too. Across the room, Claudette Ray had made her way to Serafina. She did it with considerably less ceremony than Emilio, and considerably more warmth. 7 years, Claudette said, taking both of Serafina's hands in hers. 7 years of watching that man walk into this gala without you and accepting his excuses. You were very patient, Serafina said with a faint smile. I was curious. Claudette corrected her. There is a difference. Serafina laughed briefly, genuinely, and Claudette squeezed her hands once before letting them go. I want to know everything, Claudette said. Later, Serafina said, but yes. Claudette glanced over her shoulder at Dorian. She had a particular expression of a woman who has suspected something for years and is now experiencing the specific satisfaction of being correct. Then she drifted back toward her own circle. She was already leaning toward the woman beside her, with a look that suggested the next 10 minutes of conversation had just been decided. Dorian watched all of it. He watched 3 more people approach Serafina in the span of 15 minutes. Men he had spent years cultivating, whose cooperation he had worked for, whose respect he believed he had earned through his own effort and strategy. Every one of them greeted her with a deference they had never extended to him. Not close to it. She knows all of them, Vivian said quietly. She wasn't asking. It appears so, Dorian said. His voice was level, but it cost him something to keep it that way. Dorian, Vivian said carefully. What exactly does your wife do? Dorian didn't answer immediately. Because the honest answer to that question, the answer he was only now assembling from 7 years of evidence he had misread entirely, was that Serafina didn't do anything in the visible sense. She simply was someone. Someone whose name, whose blood, whose silent presence in the background of his life had been functioning as a kind of structural support for everything he had built. The way a foundation works, unseen beneath a building that the owner walks around in every day congratulating himself for constructing. He had sent that foundation home to pack its things, and now it was standing in the middle of his ballroom in a black gown, receiving his allies like a head of state. And not one person in the room thought that was unusual, because not one person in this room was surprised. They had all known. Every single one of them had known who she was. He was in all likelihood the only person at the annual Syndicate Elite Gala who had spent 7 years not knowing what he was married to. And from the look on Nikolai Dreov's face, standing 3 feet behind Serafina, watching Dorian with the patient, unreadable expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific outcome. That fact wasn't lost on anyone. Vivian set her glass down on the nearest tray. I think, she said slowly, that I may have stepped into something I didn't fully understand. For once, Dorian had absolutely nothing to say to that. Serafina waited until the room had finished forming its opinion of her before she moved toward Dorian. That was intentional. There is a principle in negotiation, one her father had taught her at an age when most children were still learning their multiplication tables. The party who moves second holds the advantage, because the party who moves first has already revealed that they feel the need to. Dorian hadn't moved toward her. Whether that was pride or paralysis, she neither knew nor particularly cared. She crossed the room at her own pace, Nikolai a step behind her. She stopped in front of the small table near the bar where Dorian was standing. Vivian was still beside him. To Vivian's credit, she didn't pretend the situation was normal. Her expression was that of a woman who was genuinely trying to understand the geometry of a room that had reorganized itself entirely in the last 20 minutes, and finding to her discomfort that she was standing in the wrong part of it. Serafina, Dorian said. He had arranged his face into something composed, but his eyes were doing the thing eyes do when a person is working very hard to appear calm. They moved slightly too fast, reading her, reading Nikolai, reading the room. Dorian, she replied. A pause. You look well, he said. It was, under the circumstances, such a spectacularly inadequate thing to say that Claudette Reyes, standing within earshot, pressed her lips together to keep from reacting. Serafina opened her clutch. She withdrew the folded document, the single page she had carried from the penthouse. The Morty family's notarized 40% stake in the Castellan Empire. She placed it on the table between them with the same unhurried steadiness with which she had done everything else tonight. She didn't slide it dramatically. She simply set it down. Dorian looked at it. He didn't pick it up. What is this? He said. You can read, she said simply. A brief silence. He picked it up. She watched his eyes move across the page. The legal language, the Morty seal, the percentage figure, the date of original transfer, which was 3 weeks before their wedding, meaning her father had placed this stake in trust for her before he had even met Dorian properly. She watched the moment he found that particular detail, because his jaw did a specific thing that it did when he was recalculating. He set the document back down. This isn't the place for this conversation, he said, lowering his voice. You chose the place, she said without lowering hers. You chose this gala as the evening you intended to finalize our separation. You made that choice in our bedroom 3 hours ago. I'm simply honoring it. Dorian's eyes cut briefly to Nikolai, then back to her. You brought him here, he said. Nikolai came, she said. There is a difference. Serafina, Dorian said. And there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. Not quite desperation, but the beginning of it. The outer edge. The place a man reaches when he understands that the ground beneath an argument has shifted, and he hasn't yet found new footing. Whatever you think you're doing tonight, I am assuming direct control of the Morty family's assets, she said plainly, evenly. In the same tone one might use to discuss a diary appointment. Effective tonight, she continued. The legal process began this afternoon. Ferris filed the paperwork at 4. By morning, the 40% stake, currently listed under a dormant holding company, will be transferred back into active Morty governance. My governance? Dorian stared at her. That stake is tied to my operations, he said, his voice dropping further. Half of what I've built runs through those holdings. I know, she said. I've known for 7 years. You could have... He started. What? She said. I could have what, Dorian? He stopped because there was genuinely no version of that sentence that ended well for him. And somewhere beneath the shock and the scrambling, he was intelligent enough to know it. She had protected those holdings for 7 years. She had kept them quiet, kept them stable, kept them entirely out of the way of his ambitions, while he built on top of them without ever once asking what was underneath. He had assumed the ground was solid because it had never moved. He had never considered that it was solid because someone was choosing to keep it that way. Vivienne, who had been standing very still throughout this exchange, looked at Dorian. She looked at him with the careful attention of a person who is finalizing a conclusion they began forming 20 minutes ago. Then she looked at Serafina, not with hostility, with something closer to recognition. The look of a woman who has just fully understood the shape of a situation and is deciding quickly and cleanly where she stands in relation to it. She picked up her clutch from the bar. She set down her champagne glass. She didn't say anything to Dorian. She didn't say anything to Serafina either. She simply stepped back, turned, and walked away. She moved with the particular composed dignity of a woman who has decided that she would like to be on the right side of an exit. Dorian watched her go. Then he looked back at Serafina. You planned all of this, he said. No, she said. You planned this evening. I simply responded to your plan with a better one. She folded the document and placed it back in her clutch. You told me I was never built for rooms like this, she said. She looked at him for a long, even moment. Look around you, she said quietly. He didn't need to look around. He already knew what he would see. Serafina turned to leave. It was a clean movement, unhurried. Final in the way that only movements made by people who have nothing left to prove tend to be. That was when Dorian's hand came out. He reached for her arm. Not gently, not with any particular thought behind it, but with the blind reflex of a man watching something valuable walk away from him and reacting before his better judgment could intervene. His fingers closed around her wrist. Serafina stopped. She didn't pull away. She didn't turn back to face him. She simply stopped and looked down at his hand on her wrist with the expression of someone who has found an unexpected insect on their sleeve. Not frightened, not angry, just faintly surprised that it had the nerve. "Serafina," Dorian said. His voice was lower now, stripped of the flatness it had carried earlier in the evening when he believed he was in control of the room. "We need to talk about this properly. Not here. Not like this. Let me explain." "Explain what?" she said quietly. She still hadn't turned. "There's nothing you can say to me tonight that will change what was filed at 4 o'clock this afternoon," she said. "And there's nothing you can say to me tonight that will change what you said to me at 7 o'clock this evening." "You were very clear," she said. "Be clear now." His grip didn't loosen. And that was the moment Nikolai moved. He didn't move quickly. He didn't raise his voice, or shift his expression, or do any of the things that men do when they want a situation to feel dangerous. He simply stepped forward and placed himself between Dorian and Serafina. He moved with the calm, considered movement of someone repositioning a piece of furniture. Deliberate, unrushed, and entirely certain that it wouldn't need to be moved again. He was a large man. Standing at that distance between those two people, with that particular stillness, he occupied the space the way a wall occupies it. Dorian's hand released Serafina's wrist. Whether he chose to release it, or whether the choice was made for him by some deep, well-calibrated instinct for self-preservation, only Dorian could say. The room, which had been operating at a careful murmur throughout the exchange, went a degree quieter still. Nobody moved toward them. Nobody spoke. People who operate in the world, the syndicate elite Gala, represents understand at a very fundamental level when they are watching something they shouldn't interrupt. And this was very clearly one of those moments. Dorian looked at Nikolai. Nikolai didn't look at Dorian. This was perhaps the most pointed thing he could have done, and he did it without any indication that it was intentional, which made it considerably more effective than if it had been theatrical. He looked at Serafina. She had turned now and was facing him, and something in her expression had shifted from the controlled composure she had been carrying all evening to something quieter, less armored. "I owe you something," Nikolai said. His voice was low, not quite private, but not performing either. Simply the voice of a man saying something he had decided to say. "I should have said it before tonight," he continued. "I didn't because you asked me not to. Because I asked you to stay in the shadows," she said. "Yes," he said. A brief pause settled between them. "Your father asked me a long time ago to look after you," Nikolai said. "I told him I would. I kept that promise badly." Serafina looked at him. "You kept it exactly the way I asked you to," she said. "That's the same thing," he said. "If you had asked me to do it differently, I should have done it differently." She held his gaze. Around them, the room continued its careful silence. The kind that a crowd produces when it collectively understands it is witnessing something it will be discussing for years. Claudette, from her position near the far side of the room, had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Emilio Vance had his arms folded and was watching with the expression of a man who has just seen a long-running equation finally resolve. "I've waited 7 years," Nikolai said, "to stand beside you without being asked to stand somewhere else. 7 years of watching from the right distance, staying at the correct angle, making sure I was never close enough to be noticed. I'm done with the correct angle," he said. "I won't go back to it." Serafina was quiet for a moment. Behind her, Dorian stood absolutely still, and the stillness wasn't composure. It was the specific stillness of a man who has just heard in public the full weight of what he failed to understand in private. The woman he had dismissed as too still, too quiet, too soft for his world, had been loved for 7 years by the one man in the room that his entire world deferred to. And he hadn't known. He hadn't even thought to ask. Serafina looked at Nikolai for a long moment. Then she said simply, "I know." 2 words. But the way she said them, with that particular evenness that carries more inside it than most speeches, told Nikolai and the room, and anyone paying close enough attention, that she had known for a while. She had simply been waiting, as she had waited for everything, until the right moment. She reached out and touched his arm briefly, and then she turned toward the exit. Nikolai fell into step beside her. Neither of them looked back. They walked out the way they had walked in together, unhurried, without looking back. The doors of the Meridian Hall closed behind them with the soft, weighted click of a room sealing itself around a new reality, and the night air outside received them without ceremony. Just the cool of it, and the city lights, and the car already waiting at the bottom of the steps. Inside the ballroom, the silence that followed their exit lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the room exhaled. Conversations resumed, but they were different conversations now. Lower, more deliberate. The kind that happen when a room full of careful people begins the collective work of adjusting to a shift in the landscape. Dorian hadn't moved. He was standing exactly where he had been when Serafina turned and walked away. And the stillness he was wearing no longer looked like composure. It looked like what it was. Emilio Vance crossed to him, unhurried, and stood beside him, in the way that men in their world stand beside each other when they have something to say that won't be comfortable to hear. She filed this afternoon, Dorian said before Emilio could speak. I know, Emilio said. How long have you known? Dorian asked. About the stake, about all of it. Emilio was quiet for a moment. Long enough, he said. It was, Dorian noted, almost exactly what Nikolai had said to Serafina 2 hours ago in the penthouse, which meant it was either a coincidence or the most honest answer available. And in his experience, those two things were often the same. Every agreement we structured through the Eastern channels, Dorian said slowly. The brower contracts, the meridian access. Emilio didn't confirm or deny. He simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the space near the exit where Serafina had been standing minutes ago. Dorian, he said finally, you built something real. Nobody is telling you otherwise. But you built it on ground that wasn't entirely yours, and the person who owned the ground was generous enough to let you build on it without charging rent for 7 years. A pause. That arrangement, Emilio said carefully, has now changed. He gave Dorian a brief, not unkind look, and then he walked away toward the bar. 3 men immediately closed in around him with the instinct of people gravitating toward a source of current information. Dorian stood alone. He reached for his glass, found it empty, and set it back down. Vivian was gone. He hadn't seen her leave. He hadn't registered at the moment she decided that the evening had become something she wanted no further part in. But she wasn't in the room, and she wasn't coming back. And he understood that with the flat certainty of a man receiving information he had already, somewhere beneath the surface, prepared himself for. He looked around the room. People were talking. Nobody met his eyes. Not because they were avoiding him. People in this world were too practiced for anything as obvious as deliberate avoidance. They simply had other things to look at now, other conversations to be having, other allegiances to quietly reposition. It was, in its way, the loneliest thing Dorian had ever experienced in a room full of people. Outside, the car moved through the city in the easy, gliding way of a vehicle being driven by someone who knows where they're going and sees no reason to hurry. Serafina sat with her head resting slightly back, watching the lights pass the window. She didn't feel what she had expected to feel. She had thought in the abstract imagining of this evening that she had done over the past week that there would be something louder at the end of it. Some bright, clear feeling that announced itself properly. Instead, there was quiet, a clean, uncluttered quiet. The kind that arrives when something that has been making noise for a very long time finally stops. Nikolai was beside her. He hadn't spoken since they got in the car, which was exactly right, because he understood, as he seemed to understand most things, what a moment required of him. After a while, she said, "Where are we going?" "Wherever you want," he said. She looked at him. "That is not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it is true." She returned her gaze to the window. "I need to call Ferris tomorrow," she said. "First thing." "He'll be expecting it," Nikolai said. "And the board meeting," she said, "by the end of the week." "I'll have the room ready," he said. She nodded slowly. Then after a moment, Nikolai. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight. For all of it." He looked at her. And for a moment, the careful steadiness he wore like a second skin shifted slightly. Not much, but enough. "You didn't need me tonight," he said. "You brought yourself into that room." "I know," she said. "That is not why I'm thanking you." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached across and placed his hand over hers, where it rested on the seat between them. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Outside, the city moved past in long gold streaks. Indifferent, continuous, entirely unbothered by the fact that somewhere in a ballroom behind them, a man was standing alone beside an empty glass. And somewhere in this moving car, a woman was sitting in the quiet of a life that had just finally returned to its correct shape. Her name was Serafina Morty Voss. She had buried it once for love and kept it safe in a sealed drawer for 7 years. Tonight she had taken it back. And she intended from this point forward to be very careful about what she buried and for whom. Some things, once retrieved, you simply don't put down again. And that is where we leave her, not broken, not bitter. Not looking back at a man who never understood what he had until the room showed him. We leave Serafina Morty Voss exactly where she belongs. Moving forward with her name restored, and her hand held by someone who always knew its worth. Some people spend their whole lives shrinking themselves to fit into spaces that were never built for them. The lesson here is a simple one. Know what you carry, know what it's worth, and be very deliberate about who you carry it for. Because the right person will never ask you to make yourself smaller. They will simply stand beside you and let the room figure it out.